In a town forgotten by time, where trouble rides in with the wind and legends fade slower than scars, they chose the wrong person to provoke, and by the time they realized, it was already too late. Calla Merrick felt the barbed wire singing through her gloves, as if the fence line could carry a tune only grief could hear. The wire had a voice today, thin, thrumming, almost mean, and she could feel it in her molars and the bones of her wrists. The child inside her kicked once, a quick, startled twitch beneath her apron, and she pressed the heel of her hand there on reflex, a steadying touch for both of them. Late light gathered along the ridges like honey, heavy and gold. A wind came down off the mesa, smelling of creosote and dust, and a faraway promise of rain that never quite arrived. "Told you I've got it," she murmured, not to the land, but to herself, and to the memory of a man who would never hear it. Then she set her boot against the bottom wire and levered the come-along tight until the strand went from slack to singing straight. The 3-mile creek traced a silvery scar through the Merrick place, not wide, but fast. It came down from the high country with meltwater and a mean habit of jumping its banks in spring. Any fool could tell where this fence stood was honest, hammered in years ago by Calla's husband before the accident took him. No, not accident, she corrected herself, jaw hardening. Men called things accidents when it made it easier to sleep. Ezra Merrick had been found in his own hay shed under a toppled stack that never fell by itself, a boot print in the chaff that didn't match his size. Since the funeral, 3 posts had been sawn through in the night and the wire hung like a crucifixion between them by morning. Twice now, Calla had mended it. Today would make 3. "You shouldn't be out here," Doc Hollis had said the week prior, tapping the edge of his mustache with a long finger, meaning her belly and the July heat and the notion of a woman alone doing a man's work. Calla remembered how her mouth had smiled while something inside her grew colder and cleaner than any creed. She had told the town doctor what she'd told everyone, that fences didn't repair themselves, that coyotes didn't ask whether a widow was too tired to set a snare, that mortgage notices didn't take tea and sympathy. Besides, the fence was the line between what was hers and what was coming to take it. The post hole was ready. She'd widened it by hand because the auger had too much wobble in it now that the gear was cracked. Shale clinked against her shovel. She added water from the dipper and tamped the earth down around the new cedar the way Ezra had shown her, back when they were 2 green fools who believed days would carry on forever, simply because they deserved it. She'd been 19 then, with wrists like willow stems and a laugh that startled horses. Now she was 27 and ironed from in to out, but her laugh had learned to live behind her teeth. A crow watched from the top of the cottonwood on the other bank. It called once, like a judge reminding the courtroom who held the gavel. Calla knotted the wire, turned the knot with her pliers until the twist lay neat as a seam, then eased the tension so the staple would take. A small satisfaction, the kind that made her heart stand up a little inside her chest. The wind shifted. It carried with it the bitter, old saddle smell of men who'd ridden hard. She straightened slowly, sweat cooling on her neck, and looked south along the fence line. 3 riders, shouldering into the sun, no hurry in them, the kind of no hurry that meant they belonged to trouble that didn't have to run. She told the baby under her hand to be calm, to ride out the spike of fear like a bad contraction that passed if you breathe steady. She reached for the Springfield leaning against a cottonwood, not openly, just the way you might reach for your hat when company arrived, and then she stood as square as a gate and waited. "Afternoon, Ms. Merrick," said the lead man when they were close enough to spit. He was lean and handsome in the way of a thistle, all angles and stickers, his hat brim cut sharp like he'd used a knife on it. Eamon Rusk lived 3 sections over and believed anything he could see from his porch belonged to him. His father had fenced this country first and bragged about it until his teeth fell out. "Afternoon," Calla said, level. "You're on the wrong side of the creek, Mr. Rusk." He smiled as if the remark confirmed a private bet. The two hands behind him sat easy in their saddles, eyes washed out blue of winter sky. Cowboys hired for the season, paid to laugh at whatever his boss laughed at and kick whatever he wanted kicked. "See, that's where we come to our understanding," Eamon drawled. "A flood year'll move a ribbon of water, and when water moves, so do lines. That's just how God draws it. This here fence is cutting me out of 20 acres I've got brand paper on." Brand paper. He meant a deed from Bram Kettering at the courthouse, that smiling fox who wrote numbers so they slipped their collars and ran where he wanted. A notary stamp did not make a lie into a truth. Calla could have said all that. She didn't. She only nodded at the cedar post she'd just sunk. Funny how the water moved the fence at night with a saw. The smile went off his face like a lamp snuffed. He looked down at her stomach and back up. "You shouldn't be doing a man's work in your condition. Folks might think you've got no help. They might think this place is soft." "Folks would be wrong," Calla said, and her voice was quiet in that way that men looked at their hands. Eamon's horse sidled 2 steps, feeling his rider's temper. "There's ways to make neighbors of each other," he drawled. "You let that fence drift to the true line, I'll send boys to help throw feed and fix your barn roof. Too bad about Ezra. Man should have braced his haystack better." Her throat tried to close on her. She wouldn't let it. "A man should have a face when he talks about the dead," she said, and something in the way she said it made one of the hands look away. Eamon lifted a brow, no more. "Suit yourself," he said, "but I'd hate to hear coyotes got your calves. Hate more to hear about a night fire." He turned his horse. "Ride, boys." They went north along the fence, slow as a sermon, looking at everything like they were pricing it. Calla did not move until the dust of their passing became just dust again, and the crow in the cottonwood said what it had to say. Then she let out a breath she didn't remember holding, and set her palm to her belly. The baby had settled. "We don't sell," she told the small, stubborn heat inside her. "We don't scare. We don't beg." In town, Sheriff Collie Danner would pretend his badge wasn't bought polish, would shake his head with the pity of cowards, and tell her there was nothing to be done unless someone saw a man with a saw. Bram Kettering would pour coffee and lean back in his chair and say words like foreclosure and unfortunate and graceful solution. She could hear them as clearly as if they were already spoken, and it simplified something in her. She set to work again. That was how you won here. One post, one stretch, one breath. She sank another cedar, tamped it, draped the barbed wire, tightened it until it sang like a bowstring. Afternoon slid into evening. Shade moved across the creek like an animal that didn't want to be seen. Her back should have hurt worse than it did. Maybe grief dulled more than the heart. By the time she hammered the last staple into the 3rd post, she could see the roofline of the Merrick house catching firelight from the west. Ezra had laid that roof with 2 borrowed cousins and a single day that lasted forever. Calla felt the ache of his absence the way a tongue finds a cracked tooth. She rolled her shoulders and gathered her tools, listening. The land had many voices. Tonight, its voice was wary. She heard them before she saw him. Not Eamon Rusk's boys. This cadence was different, slower, heavier in the ground, like a wagon, but not a wagon. A single horse carrying a man the horse had learned to become. She turned with her hand on the rifle. The rider who came out of the purple shadow between the cottonwoods was large enough to make distance seem smaller. He rode a dun gelding whose hide had been brushed until it shone like wheat, and the animal moved with the kind of disciplined ease that meant the man on its back knew hands and hooves, miles and mornings. The rider dismounted in one fluid swing and stood, and the word that came to Calla unbidden was not big, but steadied. He took off his hat, which was dark and sweat-stained in the band, and he held it against his chest the way a man introduces himself to a widow without words. "Ms. Merrick," he said, voice low like water in a well. "I'm Gideon Pike." She had heard the name without ever meeting the shape it belonged to, Pike Range ran the length of the North Valley, 35,000 acres of alfalfa bottoms and sage and good grass, black cattle like punctuation marks across it. Gideon Pike had come down from Montana 10 years prior, according to men in barbershops, and he'd brought money and a reputation for not playing at pork barrel politics. He was said to be gentle with horses and hard with thieves. It was also said that when he stood, he cast a long shadow.
"Mr. Pike," Calla answered, straightening. Her temples had begun to throb, but she would die before she let a stranger see how weary she was. "If you've come to sell me posts at a discount, I'll take it under consideration." The corner of his mouth turned. "If I'd come to sell you anything, I'd have brought a salesman." His gaze traveled the length of the newly tightened fence and returned with something like respect in it. "You did this alone?" She glanced at her hands without meaning to. They were rope-burned and nicked, amber with dust. "It's my fence. Most folks around here would have called neighbors." "Most folks around here would have come with a saw," Calla said, and immediately cursed herself. It wasn't safe to speak sharp to a man who owned that much sky. But Gideon only nodded like she'd confirmed what he already knew. "I saw Eamon Rusk and his boys on my South Road an hour ago. Looked like men who don't think fences should tell them no." He stepped to the post and pressed his thumb against the barb as if testing the truth of her work. "You tighten like a hand who's swung wire 3 years running. That's the kind of nut my foreman puts his initials on, not because he's proud, but because if it fails, he wants to know why. Foremen who initial their knots strike me as men who've learned to be careful after mistakes," she said. He considered that and smiled, which made him less imposing and more human in ways that warmed the air between them a half-degree. "They strike me that way too." He glanced at her belly and back to her face without a flicker of pity. Not many men could manage that. "You fixin' fence in your condition because you have to," he said, not a question. "Because I choose to," Calla returned, and then softer. "Because there isn't anyone else. My hand Jory says he saw 2 men riding nightlines on your east pasture last week." "I saw them too," Calla murmured. "I prefer giving men a chance to rethink themselves in daylight." "Daylight doesn't always make men think better," Gideon said. He set his hat back on his head and squinted up the draw like a man measuring weather without a barometer. "I didn't come to tell you how to run your place. I came to say I heard something at Bram Kettering's office that made the hair rise on my arms." Her jaw got tight. "The only news Bram sells is bad. Rusk put in a petition to have your boundaries surveyed anew. Sheriff Danner endorsed it in pencil before Bram even read it aloud. That means Eamon's gonna ride his claim hard, and Danner's gonna pretend he can't hear you over the sound of Rusk money." He met her eyes. They were the color of wet bark, steady. "You need a witness when the hammer falls." Calla felt something in her chest unclench and clench again, as if relief had touch, but not permission. "You offering to stand there and watch?" "I'm offering to stand there and not blink, and to bring a man who knows the law and enjoys reading it at men like Bram until their faces itch. Men like that charge by the minute. I've got minutes and use for them." He glanced toward the house. "You got water on?" "I've got a pump that bites if you don't treat her right, but she'll pour if you sweet-talk her first." He laughed, a short sound, like a shovel's first bite finding purchase, and something like dignity moved through her for having made him do it. He led his dun to the trough and worked the pump with the easy patience of someone who liked work for its own sake. The gelding blew bubbles in the trampled water and nuzzled Calla's wrist with a wet nose, and before she could stop herself, Calla set her cheek against the animal's muzzle the way she had not let herself do since Ezra. "You got someone to see you to the doctor if it's time?" It won't be time for 6 weeks, Kala said. She believed that with the ferocious hope of the stubborn. Doc Hollis comes out on Sundays. Babies come out when they want, Gideon murmured. He studied the ridge again, and the hollows where a man could sit down behind Chamisa and watch a widow move across her own land without the land's permission. I'm going to leave 2 hands on your south line tonight. Men I trust. They'll sit quiet. If someone comes with a saw, they'll introduce themselves. I don't want to fight, she said. I'm not offering one. I'm offering names.
Something like a laugh tried to get born in her throat and came out crooked. Why? She asked. You don't do charity. He didn't take offense. Because I run cattle under a sky I don't own. Because if men can decide fences don't matter when a woman holds the staples, then fences don't matter when any of us are tired. Because my mother fixed a gate for 3 winters with a shoulder that never healed right, while my father bled to death 200 miles away, and a neighbor watched and said he didn't want to meddle. Because I dreamed of the sound of barbed wire the night Ezra died and woke up with a taste of iron in my mouth. I don't argue with dreams. Kala watched him while he said those things. Men lied more often than they breathed when they thought it would yield them an inch. But a lie had a scent and a way of blinking. She didn't see it on him. She saw a man who took up room without asking, who would lay a hand on a colt and the colt would uncurl into it, who would sit a buckboard in floodwater and stare down the current until it thought better of itself. She saw the kind of help that didn't cost your name. What does it cost? She asked, nevertheless, because nothing true was free. Pride, he said frankly. Not yours, Rusk's. He won't like that anyone stood beside you. It'll make him bolder in the ways that turn sloppy. Sloppy men show the law their throats if you make 'em. He looked at her a long beat. You don't have to say yes now, but do one thing. When they come again, and they will, don't meet them alone. She wanted to say she had met everything alone for months and would go on doing it. She wanted to say 1,000 iron things her mouth knew by heart. Instead, she said, we'll see, because even a good fence has a gate, and she wasn't ready to open it all the way. Gideon put 2 fingers to his hat brim and swung on to the dun as if his bones had hinges. He said, I'll be up on Calfhead Ridge till moonrise, he said in the practical tone of a man setting a pan on a stove. You see anything that worries you, light a lantern on the pump. I'll see it. What if I worry all the time? Kala asked, before she could think better of showing him that small, unbeautiful truth. Then I learned to tell the difference between worry and a call for help, Gideon said. I'm good at learning what I have to. He turned his horse toward the thin road that braided into evening. Eat something with salt, he added, without looking back. You're running on anger and bread. That burns hot, but not long. He disappeared into the slow dusk like a bluff you thought was closer than it was. The yard was quiet again. A cricket called, foolish with its own music. Kala stood a long minute with her hand on the pump handle while her blood cooled and something in the ground under her boots seemed to settle. She could feel the shape of the night already. The slow-moving dark, the way the creek talked to itself in the cut, the wind coming down with a knife edge when it changed directions after midnight. She pictured 2 of Pike's men sitting in the shadow of the south fence with their hats pulled low, and she felt wariness flicker into a small, reluctant safety. She lit a lantern and went inside to start beans, cleaned her hands in water that turned the color of weak tea, and spooned stew from yesterday into a pan. Ezra's chair sat empty at the head of the table, like a scold. She put the spoon down with more noise than grace, and then put it up again, quiet. You went on, or you drowned. She ate standing, the way a ranchwoman eats when she's on the clock of everything. After she'd checked the heifer near calving and counted her chickens and latched the barn twice, she walked out to the pump and hung the lantern the way Gideon had said, because it was common sense and not a surrender. She climbed the porch and lowered herself into Ezra's coat that she had left draped over the rocking chair since the funeral, because it held a ghost of his smell. The night grew its own legs and moved over the place. Stars came out in their old, indifferent order. On the ridge, the pale scab of the moon lifted. The baby turned and pushed.
a slow wave from left to right, and Calla breathed through it, jaw loose the way she'd read would help. Sometime after midnight, she woke with her chin on her chest and her hands cold. She had not intended to sleep. That was how the night got you. She listened and heard it immediately. Not horses, feet. More than one man's feet. The barn door creaked in that particular guilty way that meant a hand didn't know the door tried to lift as he pulled and failed. Calla's blood went clean. She was off the chair and down the steps without thinking, and then stopped herself and made thinking happen. She took up the Springfield and worked the bolt. The sound was a small church bell. Down at the south fence line, a stub of fire flared and went out. A match struck and pinched. She moved along the porch shadow and stepped into the yard where the cottonwoods made black lace out of starlight. "Who's there?" she called. Not loud, just enough to put a name to it if the night wanted to. Silence answered, and the sweet stink of kerosene. Then a whisper, the kind of laugh men do when they think the dark is on their side. Calla took 2 steps toward the barn. Her belly felt heavy. Not frightening heavy, just present. The pump lantern burned steadily, its glass wicking a small comet into the air. She could see the barn's open mouth now, and a shadow within it that crouched wrong for an animal. "You come out where I can see you," she said. The Springfield didn't waver. The hands that held it were steady because they had to be. Fear could find a place later when there was a later to put it in. A figure moved. Not a man. And then, yes, a man, but smaller than the fear had made him. He stepped into the spill of the pump light, and Calla saw Brock Rusk, Eamon's cousin, a boy who grinned through dances and peeled cards from the bottom of decks when he thought the church ladies weren't watching. He held a bottle with cloth ragging out of it. The rag was damp and stank. It took her a beat too long to accept what her eyes showed. He cradled fire in his hands like a newborn. "You set that down," Calla said, and her voice surprised both of them. It carried steel and an old winter in it. "You set it down and put your palms on your head." Brock's mouth opened and closed twice before words came. "Ain't no law says you can point a gun at a man for visiting," he said, but there was water in his tone. "There's a law about a man who sets fire to a widow's barn. It's short. It ends with a rope." He looked over her shoulder, and Calla felt the world move a hair to the left. Where there was one boy with a bottle, there were 2 more with matches and a man with a plan to make them believe they were men. She didn't take her eyes off Brock. "You come out," she said. "All the way." 2 more figures slid from the barn's mouth, one of Eamon's regular hands and a man Calla didn't know down from the railroad crews by the shine of his boots. The stranger had a knife in his belt longer than a prayer. The regular hand had the particular slant to his hat that might as well have been a calling card. Eamon wasn't far. "You boys want to leave now. You want to take the choice while it has a pretty face." "Ma'am," and in his mouth the word had less respect than gravel. "You ain't gonna shoot. In your condition, you shouldn't even hold that weight."
Calla didn't decide to move. She was already moving. She put a bullet into the top slat of the corral post 2 feet left of the railman's ear and let the splinters tell him the rest. The night flinched and came back on its haunches, and the smell of powder made the barn smell like men instead of hay. "Leave," she said. "Leave now." "We leave when Ammon says," the regular hand said. He was the sort of man who didn't own his own face in the mirror. "And Ammon says the line's moving." "The only thing moving here is you," Calla answered, and then the railman lunged, quick on city feet. He had the bottle in his right hand and the match in his left, and he brought them together in the tiny, deadly wedding men like Bram Kettering never had to see. Calla fired once, low. The bottle jumped from his hand and broke on the hardpan in a teeth-clenching splash that went up her nose and into her throat. Flame whooshed, a small dragon, and then guttered as the kerosene soaked into dirt. The railman bent double with a sound like a kicked goat and clutched at his thigh. She had clipped him there. It would hurt, and it would not kill him. That was the line she kept for herself. She did not know if she could keep it if they pushed her. Someone clapped slowly. The sound was gentle and hateful. Amon Rusk stepped out from behind the cottonwood with a smile he probably practiced at mirrors. 2 more men came with him, one with a lariat coiled loose in his palm. Amon surveyed the extinguished fire with interest, the pump lantern, the pregnant woman with the rifle, and the boy cousin who looked like he had misheard a story and found himself inside the wrong ending. "Well," Amon said, "there's something to be said for a woman who can shoot straight. Ezra taught you that?" "Ezra taught me how to mend. Everything else I learned because of men like you." Amon's face didn't change, but his hand made a small signal, and the railman uncoiled it in a way that told her this wasn't a bluff. "Step aside from the door," Amon said. "Barns burn fast. Better to watch from the yard if you care for your eyebrows." "No," Kala said. "You think one woman can hold a yard against 5 men?" Amon asked almost kindly. "I think one woman already is," Kala answered, and in her mouth the words weren't bravado, they were arithmetic. She had 1 bullet less and 5 men more. She felt the baby push, a slow warning under her hand. She breathed like a mare at the end of a hard pull. "You're making this uglier than it has to be," Amon said. "Bram's got the papers, Danner's got the badge, I've got the men. You've got sentiment. Sentiment doesn't keep calves from bawling." He flicked his eyes at the boy. "Brock, be useful for once. Take a rifle." Brock took a half step like a dog that didn't want the whip and then stopped dead as the night behind Amon changed shape. It was a small change, the way a long shadow rearranges when the moon walks, but Kala felt it in her spine and her breath went deep of its own accord. Gideon Pike came out of the ladder dark by the corral gate without hurry and without noise, as if the night had made him and he was tired of pretending otherwise. He was unarmed to the eye if your eyes were poor. If your eyes were the kind that counted, you saw the holstered Schofield at his hip, and more dangerous, the way he held his shoulders, soft, ready, as if he trusted his hands more than his gun. "Evening, Rusk," Gideon said, and his voice made the air bank and swirl like water around a boulder. "Funny night to hold a barn raising." Amon's mouth went tight, then eased. He tipped his hat as if they were passing church plates. "Pike." "You brought more men than you brought mercy," Gideon said mildly. "That seems out of balance to me." "Balance is what a deed is for," Amon returned. "Deeds are for people who know the difference between lines and theft. I'm not seeing that difference in your hands tonight." "You got a lot to say for a man whose land don't touch this place," Amon said. "You come to buy it?" "I come because I heard a widow hung a lamp," Gideon replied, and in that sentence there was something that made the lariat man look at his rope like maybe it belonged to someone else. "I come because I don't like the smell of kerosene when it's carried by boys who aren't old enough to shave right." His eyes touched Brock, and Brock's hand opened and the match fell without meaning to. "And I come because men who think they can take do worse when someone is watching." 3 on 5, Amon said, counting Kala as a half with a flick of his gaze at her belly. "Those ain't terrible odds." "Depends which half you mean," Gideon said. "The one holding the gun or the one learning your name?" He nodded at Kala's stomach without looking away from Amon's face. "You burn this barn down, and you're gonna hear that child call you by it in his sleep until the day you die." Amon's lip lifted. "You starting to sound like a preacher. You want me to kneel?" "I want you to leave," Gideon said, and his voice lost none of its calm while the edges of it sharpened. "I want you to come back in daylight with a surveyor and a lawman who doesn't hide, and we can settle a line without pretending this is about something else." "What else would it be about?" Amon asked, too quick. "Killing the weak because it makes you feel strong. Men do a lot of foolish, ugly things to avoid looking the truth in the face. This truth has a woman's eyes and a hammer in her hand. It ain't gonna blink." The lariat man took a step and Gideon's head turned a fraction and the man stopped without knowing why. Amon licked his thumb and ran it along his mustache like he was tuning a violin. "You can't watch her forever," Amon said to Gideon. "You've got your own fences, your own fires. If I were a betting man, and I am, I'd say you'll get bored, and when you do, I'll do what I came to do." Gideon smiled, a winter smile.
Then tonight will be the last night you get to come as far as my south line before I put salt in your coffee every time you drink it. You know how many ways there are to make a man's life smaller without touching his house? I do. He looked at Eamon like a wheel at a rut. You think I got a big spread because I like owning things. Truth is, I like not owing men like you. Eamon flicked his fingers. His men shifted. The rail hand grunted and straightened, angry with pain. Brock swayed in place, understanding too late that stories were dangerous long before they required guns. Calla felt sweat break across her spine and cooled the moment it came, a new wind snaking down from the ridge. Her left calf cramped and released. The baby rolled once and settled. The creek talked in its silver voice, saying old names. Last chance, Rusk. Take it while it's still called a chance. Eamon tilted his head. Boys, he said, without raising his voice, take the rifle. The yard tightened like a hand. Brock lurched a step he didn't mean. The lariat hissed and opened. The railman lit a match with his teeth because theater makes poor men feel rich. Calla fired once, low. The bottle jumped from his hand and broke on the hardpan in a teeth-clenching splash that went up her nose and into her throat. Flame whooshed, a small dragon, and then guttered as the kerosene soaked into dirt. The railman bent double with a sound like a kicked goat and clutched at his thigh. Shit clipped in there. It would hurt, and it would not kill him. That was the line she kept for herself. She did not know if she could keep it if they pushed her.
Silence did that thing where it gets louder. Gideon's jaw flinched. Benno's gun never wavered, but his eyes did that slow blink some men do when their souls make bets with patience. Bram brightened like a snake seeing bare ankle. He produced the folded deed in the fountain pen and rode close enough to hand them across with an air of magnanimity that made the pen look murderous. Calla took both. She unfolded the paper carefully because rage is sloppy, and she had vowed to herself not to be sloppy the day Ezra died. Her eyes went down the lines, not as a woman who couldn't read might have pretended, but as a woman who understood that every crooked letter in this county had been used to try to make her smaller. The words said foreclosure and forbearance and trust, the way liars do when they want to hang you with a rope they call their mercy. The signature line waited like a mouth. She read to the bottom, put the pen between her teeth, tucked the deed against the porch post, and with two hands and all the slow iron patience the last months had taught her, tore along the fold. The deed split into two equal betrayals. She tore each again. 8 white birds lifted and fell at her feet. Bram made a sound like a tea kettle. You brought me kindling, she said, and her voice was almost sweet. Thank you. She let the scraps fall into the pan of water Jory had set by the threshold and watched the ink bleed the way men who traffic in it don't like to see it do. The land agent made a reaching gesture, small, like a child learning to ask. His hand stopped halfway, unsure whether it belonged to his arm or his salary. Eamon's mouth went flat. You think you've won because a judge likes your fence, he said. You haven't met a man who needs to go home feeling he got what he paid for. Then you paid wrong, Calla said, as another contraction laid its hand across her hips and pressed. Her breath came out steady. She refused, with clean and deliberate contempt, to let these men hear the sound she would make a half-hour from now, when the work was honest and the witnesses were the wind and the women in her head who had done this before her. The dun nickering beyond the barn snapped Gideon's attention for a hair, enough for Eamon to slide a foot forward. The shadow Benno had named as line caught Eamon's spur like law. Benno's gun moved a thumb's width, and the shot took a curl off the spur and left Eamon's heel ringing. He looked down at the silver splinter, then up slowly as if the sky might have an explanation. Another half step. Don't mind me while I shorten your stride. Something flickered at the far fence, the flash of a match cupped in mean hands. Calla's whole body turned cold. She looked, saw two shapes where there should be none beyond the cottonwoods, and the smell found her a second later. Oil out of a barn, not the clean bite of lamp kerosene, but the flat, thick stink of someone who meant to ruin a field in the morning after it. Fence, she breathed. Gideon saw it as he'd said it. He'd been seeing it since he was 12, and the only way to get through a Montana winter with cattle left in March was to read darkness like a ledger. "Jory!" he called. "South!" "Already!" Jory's voice came from inside. He shot back out with a second bucket and a third and shoved them into neighbor hands who had come as far as the gate and hadn't decided if that made them heroes. "Run," he ordered, and the surprise of being told made them obey. In the yard right now, law tried to become fire, and fear tried to become law, and a child tried to become a fact. Calla put her palm to her belly and felt her son roll down like a boulder that had always been meant to come loose at this exact second. She straightened and the world steadied to her. "Mr. Rusk," and she said it like she would tell a mare to stand, "you are going to leave this yard, and you are going to turn your horse toward your own house, and you are going to find something decent to do with your hands until a better thought comes. If you do not, God help you, I will find out the price of a rope and an afternoon and a memory." He grinned. "Which is that, a threat or a sermon?" "That's a woman almost in labor telling you where thunder will land." And Gideon, God bless him, didn't take his eyes off Eamon when he smiled. The federal man, who had never meant to stand where people bleed the truth into the dirt, found his good sense and tried to ride back. His horse refused because animals know the difference between fear and future. He got down and walked, hatless, and looked less like a badge and more like someone's brother. And Calla decided not to hate him because he'd been born a man in a world where Bram wrote the rules with a pen and then tied that pen to other men's names. Bram shifted in the saddle, as if trying to get more air in a shirt that suddenly fit wrong. "Amen," he whispered, and Calla would have paid gold to know what manner of plea lived in that small word. Pride, caution, the ghost of a conscience? None of it mattered. Eamon's hand twitched, Wiley's mouth twisted. Jory's shout from the south fence went up again as new flame bit old grass. Calla's whole body bowed without her permission as a contraction took her into its patient teeth and shook her once. "Inside," Gideon said without turning, and this time she went because the line was holding, and because the next work was hers to do, and because pride had won enough in this yard for one noon. The house smelled of boiled water and wood smoke and the old clean soap her mother had made the Easter before she died. Jory had pulled the sheets and smoothed them, as if smoothing could convince a bed to be a boat. The knife lay under the frame where her mother's superstition could keep the witches of bad luck from stealing breath. Towel sat in a stack whose edges matched. The kettle whispered. The big bowl for washing steamed. Calla touched the bedpost with 2 fingers, the way you might greet an old friend you had fought with and lost to, and loved anyway. "Gates barred," Jory said from the doorway, breathless with doing too many things and not breaking any of them. His eyes went past her to the window, where the yard was a painting of men deciding what kind they were. Benno's got Eamon's attention with a sermon and a gun. Gideon standing wrong on purpose. Wrong. Left shoulder forward. He's hurting it to make them think he favors the other. Benno will slap him for it later. "Benno will try," Calla said, though her throat tightened because the picture was so clear she could have drawn it with her eyes closed. "Go," she added. "Do what's next." He did. He was a good boy. God save him until he didn't need saving. Calla kicked off her boots and set them by the bed because leaving them any other place would feel like letting go of a kind of order that had gotten her this far. Another contraction marched through, and this time she let it have her face. Her breath sounded wrong coming back into her. She fixed it like she fixed fence, steady as turns on a come-along. She sat and then stood because sitting was wrong, then sat again because standing was too. She laughed once at herself. It came out wild. The baby pushed, her body drew itself like a bow. "Ms. Merrick," Duck Hollis's voice preceded him, the way a smell sometimes precedes a room. He entered with his bag and his useful lack of poetry. "Well, thank God someone in this town knows how to boil water, and make a bed, and not faint when there's something to be done." He washed his hands in the bowl without being asked, defended his soap as if anyone had attacked it, and then set his clean fingers where mercies are negotiated. Silence did that thing where it gets louder. Gideon's jaw flinched. Benno's gun never wavered, but his eyes did that slow blink some men do when their souls make bets with patience. Bram brightened like a snake seeing bare ankle. He produced the folded deed and the fountain pen and rode close enough to hand them across with an air of magnanimity that made the pen look murderous. Calla took both. She unfolded the paper carefully because rage is sloppy, and she had vowed to herself not to be sloppy the day Ezra died. Her eyes went down the lines, not as a woman who couldn't read might have pretended, but as a woman who understood that every crooked letter in this county had been used to try to make her smaller. The words said foreclosure and forbearance and trust, the way liars do when they want to hang you with a rope they call their mercy. The signature line waited like a mouth. She read to the bottom, put the pen between her teeth, tucked the deed against the porch post, and with 2 hands and all the slow, iron patience the last months had taught her, tore along the fold. The deed split into 2 equal betrayals. She tore each again. 8 white birds lifted and fell at her feet. Bram made a sound like a tea kettle. You brought me kindling," she said, and her voice was almost sweet. "Thank you." She let the scraps fall into the pan of water Jory had set by the threshold and watched the ink bleed the way men who traffic in it don't like to see it do. The land agent made a reaching gesture, small, like a child learning to ask. His hand stopped halfway, unsure whether it belonged to his arm or his salary. Eamon's mouth went flat. "You think you've won because a judge likes your fence," he said. "You haven't met a man who needs to go home feeling he got what he paid for." "Then you paid wrong," Calla said, as another contraction laid its hand across her hips and pressed. Her breath came out steady. She refused, with clean and deliberate contempt, to let these men hear the sound she would make a half-hour from now, when the work was honest and the witnesses were the wind and the women in her head who had done this before her. The dun nickering beyond the barn snapped Gideon's attention for a hair, enough for Eamon to slide a foot forward. The shadow Benno had named as line caught Eamon's spur like law. Benno's gun moved a thumb's width, and the shot took a curl off the spur and left Eamon's heel ringing. He looked down at the silver splinter, then up slowly as if the sky might have an explanation. Another half step. "Don't mind me while I shorten your stride." Something flickered at the far fence, the flash of a match cupped in mean hands. Calla's whole body turned cold. She looked, saw 2 shapes where there should be none beyond the cottonwoods, and the smell found her a second later. Oil out of a barn, not the clean bite of lamp kerosene, but the flat, thick stink of someone who meant to ruin a field in the morning after it. "Fence," she breathed. Gideon saw it as he'd said it. He'd been seeing it since he was 12, and the only way to get through a Montana winter with cattle left in March was to read darkness like a ledger. "Jory!" he called. "South!" "Already!" Jory's voice came from inside. He shot back out with a second bucket and a third and shoved them into neighbor hands who had come as far as the gate and hadn't decided if that made them heroes. "Run!" he ordered, and the surprise of being told made them obey. In the yard right now, law tried to become fire, and fear tried to become law, and a child tried to become a fact. Calla put her palm to her belly and felt her son roll down like a boulder that had always been meant to come loose at this exact second. She straightened and the world steadied to her. "Mr. Rusk," and she said it like she would tell a mare to stand, "you are going to leave this yard, and you are going to turn your horse toward your own house, and you are going to find something decent to do with your hands until a better thought comes. If you do not, God help you, I will find out the price of a rope and an afternoon and a memory." He grinned. "Which is that, a threat or a sermon?" "That's a woman almost in labor telling you where thunder will land." And Gideon, God bless him, didn't take his eyes off Eamon when he smiled. The federal man who had never meant to stand where people bleed the truth into the dirt found his good sense and tried to ride back. His horse refused because animals know the difference between fear and future. He got down and walked, hatless, and looked less like a badge and more like someone's brother. And Calla decided not to hate him because he'd been born a man in a world where Bram wrote the rules with a pen and then tied that pen to other men's names. Bram shifted in the saddle, as if trying to get more air in a shirt that suddenly fit wrong. "Amen," he whispered, and Calla would have paid gold to know what manner of plea lived in that small word. Pride, caution, the ghost of a conscience? None of it mattered. Eamon's hand twitched, Wiley's mouth twisted. Jory's shout from the south fence went up again as new flame bit old grass. Calla's whole body bowed without her permission as a contraction took her into its patient teeth and shook her once. "Inside," Gideon said without turning, and this time she went because the line was holding, and because the next work was hers to do, and because pride had won enough in this yard for one noon. The house smelled of boiled water and wood smoke and the old clean soap her mother had made the Easter before she died. Jory had pulled the sheets and smoothed them, as if smoothing could convince a bed to be a boat. The knife lay under the frame where her mother's superstition could keep the witches of bad luck from stealing breath. Towel sat in a stack whose edges matched. The kettle whispered. The big bowl for washing steamed. Calla touched the bedpost with 2 fingers, the way you might greet an old friend you had fought with and lost to, and loved anyway. "Gates barred," Jory said from the doorway, breathless with doing too many things and not breaking any of them. His eyes went past her to the window, where the yard was a painting of men deciding what kind they were. Benno's got Eamon's attention with a sermon and a gun. Gideon standing wrong on purpose. Wrong. Left shoulder forward. He's hurting it to make them think he favors the other. Benno will slap him for it later. Benno will try, Calla said, though her throat tightened because the picture was so clear she could have drawn it with her eyes closed. Go, she added. Do what's next. He did. He was a good boy. God save him until he didn't need saving. Calla kicked off her boots and set them by the bed because leaving them any other place would feel like letting go of a kind of order that had gotten her this far. Another contraction marched through, and this time she let it have her face. Her breath sounded wrong coming back into her. She fixed it like she fixed fence, steady as turns on a come-along. She sat and then stood because sitting was wrong, then sat again because standing was too. She laughed once at herself. It came out wild. The baby pushed. Her body drew itself like a bow. "Ms. Merrick!" Doc Hollis's voice preceded him, the way a smell sometimes precedes a room. He entered with his bag and his useful lack of poetry. "Well, thank God someone in this town knows how to boil water, and make a bed, and not faint when there's something to be done." He washed his hands in the bowl without being asked, defended his soap as if anyone had attacked it, and then set his clean fingers where mercies are negotiated.
The pressure changed. Doc grunted, surprised in a pleased way, like a man who'd argued with a mule and discovered it spoke a little English. "Good," he said, and even the wind at the window leaned in to hear him. "Good. Almost." Outside, Gideon's patience broke like a well-made rope on purpose. The men at the fence beyond the cottonwoods tried once more with a splash of oil and a handful of matches, and found instead the business end of Jory's rock salt and 3 neighbors' shame. Eamon swung down at last as if the ground might apologize for being under his feet. He took 2 steps, slow, toward the porch. Benno's gun didn't rise, which is how Eamon knew it would if his boot touched shadow. He stopped and smiled over his shoulder at Bram as if to say, "You see, I could." Bram pretended not to. He was learning his own throat. Doc said, "Now," like a verdict, and Calla pushed with everything the land had taught her. She felt him slide and turn, and then the incredible slackening that made the world's edges blur with gratitude. Silence followed, terrible and absolute. "Sound," she whispered, because the world had to be taught sometimes. "Please." The cry came small and furious and alive. It landed in her ear like a psalm and then took up a second line with its own opinion of how hymns should go. Her head fell back, and tears came hot and uninvited down her temples and into her hair. Doc laughed, quick and young. "He's a good color," he said, and loud. "He'll get far on both." "Let me," Calla said, and held out her arms, and her son, wet and furious and perfect, came home. He fit under her chin like the end of a prayer. She counted him as if numbers were a charm against the next bad thought. Fingers 10, toes 10, hair dark, nose Ezra's, and mouth nobody's but his own. She kissed his head, and he hated it, and she loved him for hating everything that tried to keep him from breath. Gideon's shoulder left the doorframe and returned to the yard. Benno's voice came low. "He's here," he said to Eamon, "because even enemies should have to live with the fact of miracles." Eamon's face did that softening again, and then killed it. "Good," he said, "someone to inherit a fence that isn't hers." Gideon turned, and in the turn something changed. The quiet he'd been borrowing from the world ran out. He stepped off the porch and walked toward Eamon as if the distance were a thing the two of them had been promising each other they'd make honest for months. Wiley twitched, Jory's gun flicked, Bram swallowed his pen. The men at the fence decided discretion and shame could be cousins and backed away into cottonwood shadow. "Go home," Gideon said in a voice he had used on storms, "while there's still a road to it." Eamon smiled with half his face. "You're going to make me?" "No," Gideon said. "She already did." He tipped his head toward the window, where a woman held a new life so fiercely and tenderly that the day could not decide which part to fear more. Eamon looked. Something complicated strobed behind his eyes. Want and envy, an absence so large that it had to masquerade as pride or it would eat him. He lifted his boot. It hovered a hair above the line of shadow. Benno's gun rose the same hair because physics, thank God, is democratic. Eamon put his foot down where it had been. He tugged his gloves tighter, not because he needed them, but because men have to do something with their hands when they decide not to draw. "Tell the judge we were civil," he said, and turned his horse. Bram, astonishingly, stayed. Perhaps he thought he could salvage a paper victory from a day that made a better story without him. Perhaps he believed that if he smiled in the right places, God would mistake him for decent. He cleared his throat and found some words that knew the way to his mouth. "Ms. Merrick," he called, "the bank is prepared to—" Gideon looked at him then, truly looked, and Bram's voice lost its footing. "Prepared to what?" Gideon asked gently. "Trade the taste of smoke for ink? We are full up today." Bram flushed the color of old brick. He tugged his coat straight. The deed he had planned to defile the day with bled quietly in the basin inside. He made the mistake of glancing toward the window again and flinched as if pained. He turned his horse and followed Eamon because sometimes even snakes know when the ground is too cold for basking. Men trickled back toward town. The federal man had yet to find his hat. Jory took the gate bar down and then put it back up because his hands needed to finish steps properly or they'd shake. Benno stood with his gun down and his eyes up and his chest lifting like a bellows that learned it had more air than it thought. Inside, Doc tied and cut and wrapped with a tenderness that would make him deny later he ever did anything but scold. He set a hand to Call's shoulder, quick and square. "He's 10 minutes old," Doc said, a little breathless, as if the number itself were a horse he couldn't believe he'd caught. "Good," Calla said, and kissed the small, furious brow. "It'll keep him alive." The house took a new breath. For a sliver of time, the world was quiet for the exact right reason. Then the floor shook. Not with men, but with the kind of tremor that travels through wood and nail from far under the earth and makes women look up because they know that feeling, even if men don't. The sense that something heavy has chosen to move where nothing should be moving. Doc's head snapped toward the door. Benno's boot thumped once on the porch as if an answer. Gideon swore, the softest he'd done all day. "Mine," he said low, and was gone through the frame like a man owed a debt. "Stay," Doc told Calla, who had no intention of doing anything else, as her body decided it wasn't quite done with its work and claimed another wave or two for old time's sake. She pulled her son closer because everything else in the room had pulled away. The second tremor came with sound, the dull far boom of black powder, not enough to flatten, enough to tear. Jory shouted a word Calla told him not to use, then used it again because it was the only one that fit. Benno said no with an entire life's worth of gravity inside the syllable. Gideon called, "The draw, they left us a kiss." Doc closed his eyes briefly as if bargaining. "Benno," he shouted, "if men want to die stupid, let them. Bring me the man who doesn't, and keep this house from catching that habit." Benno slapped the door jamb like an oath and moved, his old broken ear turned toward the south like a compass. Jory ran for the pump and turned the handle until the iron squealed. The cottonwood, which had lost one arm and kept the other for shade, dropped 2 leaves in disapproval and stood like a sentinel who'd been promoted beyond its own ambition. Calla listened. She could hear the powder echo traveling the ditch, the tiny aftershocks like gravel thrown by a child, the men's feet choosing whether to be brave or loud. Her son rooted and complained, and then latched, surprise and anger and instinct learning to be an agreement. She cried then briefly and uncontrolled, because the feel of it was so ordinary, and the day had made ordinary precious.
Gideon came back to the door with dirt on his chest and sweat at his hairline and a look like math that hurts to look at. They blew the diversion on the ditch, he said as if he didn't want to. Water's running wrong. How wrong? She asked. Wrong enough to cut your lower pasture into pieces by dawn if we don't lay rock where the old bank used to be. Wrong enough to make next spring a story you don't want to tell. He swallowed. And Kenyon's boys sent word, Danners woke, talking sense, but the men who left the powder wagon are headed back this way because cowards like to look at the mess they made. So, we have two jobs, Calla said simply, because living never gave you fewer. Stop water, stop men. She kissed the crown of her son's head, tasted salt and soap and the future. She looked at Gideon. Which one do you want? He almost smiled. I want the impossible third, do both, but I'll take water. Benno can hold the road with half a song in one bullet. Jory can shame the rest. He looked at the baby with the stunned reverence of a man who had forgotten that the world occasionally offers the thing you did not dare order. He looks like Ezra around the eyes.
He looks like himself, Calla said, more fiercely than she meant to, and then softened it with a thumb rubbed along one wet eyebrow. And maybe a little like what this valley could be if men stopped buying each other's lies. Gideon nodded and turned to go. He stopped, came back one step, and, awkward and certain, touched two fingers to the baby's hair, as if swearing something into it. I'll put the water back where it belongs, he said. Hold your line. I always do, she said. He went. The house heard the men arrange themselves again. Benno's specific low bark, Jory's young echo, the riders cresting the ridge at a lope that wore gilt the way dust wears sun. The baby sighed and slept, because newborns can do that, while the world invents new disasters. Doc patted Calla's shoulder, and then, to her horror, his eyes went wet for a second. He wiped away with his sleeve like he'd gotten pepper in one. All right, he said, too gruff. You've done a day's work and then some. Lie back. Let the next part be easy. Easy is a town that delivers its own fools to the judge, she said. But she let her head fall to the pillow because she had nothing left to prove to anyone, and because there is a kind of victory in staying alive enough to sleep. She might even have slept for a handful of heartbeats, because the next sound woke her the way only sleep can be woken, from the soles up. A new rumble, closer, not powder this time. Hooves, many. Riders coming not from town, but from the far west road, a route you take if you want to skip seeing the sheriff. Jory's voice cracked on the porch. Benno said a word he hadn't said since the war. Gideon from the ditch called something that sounded like a laugh and a curse went to dance together. The baby startled and mewed, then settled when her heartbeat beat right back at him. "Who?" she called, half rising. Benno's answer came from the doorway, with a shape in it that made the room tilt. "Kettering came back," he said, voice flat as fence plank. "Brought men who don't use their own names and a Yankee who says the railroad owes him a favor. And he brought a paper with a bigger seal. Says the U.S. wants to buy this valley for a spur that got lost." Doc swore with eloquence. "They don't even pretend to dress the theft up anymore. They just ask the flag to wave while they take." Calla's laugh startled the baby, and then soothed him. "Let them try," she said. "They've never seen what a woman makes of a house when they try to pull it down while she's still in it." She swung her legs over the side of the bed, slow and steady, and stood like a woman whose knees owed her a favor. "Benno!" "Don't," he warned gently. "You sit a minute longer and let me pretend I've kept one thing easy today." Gideon appeared again, wet to the knees, hair stuck to his forehead, sling dark with ditch water and sweat. He smiled like a wolf who just remembered it knows how to run in snow. "Stone is holding," he said. "We turned the water. It will buy us a night if the sky doesn't lie again." He looked past Benno, past Doc, to the small bundle that had rearranged the house's gravity. "Is he?" "She is, and she's going to hear her mother tell him her land fought back on the day he came." She bent and kissed the furious mouth, and then looked up. Bram's back with federal names, and we're not going to sign anything today but a birth certificate, which we don't have, and a promise to stay mean." Gideon's smile went away. He looked at Benno, and they did the kind of math men who've buried friends do. "All right," Gideon said. "Doc, you get 1 more minute. Then we bar the door and make a church of this house." "Churches are where men misbehave politely," Doc said. "Make it a barn. Barns work." Hooves thundered, voices braided. A new badge glinted where the federal man had not before. The porch darkened with shadows that had come to take and found themselves at a threshold burning with a kind of fire that water doesn't put out. Gideon stepped onto the boards. Benno stood to his right. Jari took the hinge side because he was quickest. If the door flew, he could ride it down and turn it into a weapon. Doc put his hand on Call's shoulder without looking, like a man laying claim to a miracle on the ledger of a bad day. Bram's voice came smooth and pleased. "Ms. Merrick, we are here under the authority of the United States to tender you a generous—" The baby hiccuped. Calla kissed his temple. "Offer," he continued, "for purchase of easement and improvements. Say house, like a person," Benno said. "With immediate removal to alternative accommodations of equal, say shack, like a man," Gideon murmured. "Value," Bram finished, smile precise enough to cut fruit. "Do sign on the line and save us all the sadness of making a scene." "Bram," Calla said, and the tired of her made it beautiful. "I have bled this house onto its floor and made a person in it today. Do you really want to step on my porch?" Bram laughed, differently now with men behind him. "I don't have to, my dear. The government will." He gestured, and the federal badge moved. Gideon breathed once, slow. He looked back. His eyes found Calla's, and she saw him ask a question he had not asked anyone since he was old enough to hold a halter. "Do I break or do I hold?" She answered with her chin. "Hold." He nodded. Then he did the bravest, strangest thing he had seen a man do all day. He bent, took the burned broom from where it lay black-mouthed on the step, and set it across the threshold again, char and all, like a child's drawing of a fence. He looked at Bram and smiled without amusement. "Now you need something bigger than a badge," he said softly. "You need a god." The federal man, insulted on behalf of paperwork everywhere, lifted his arm. "By order of—" From the south line came a scream, not human, the kind of sound cattle make when the world opens at their feet, the kind of sound that pulls every nerve in a rancher's body toward it like a magnet. Gideon's head snapped that way. Benno's did too. Juri's hands clenched on the hinge. Doc's fingers dug into Calla's shoulder hard enough to be its own prayer. "The bank," Gideon said, horror soft and childish at the edges. "They blew the old bank again. It's caving." And then all the world went to motion at once. Riders shoving forward, men turning back, water choosing the wrong place on purpose, dirt giving way like rotten teeth, the porch stoving under a crack that ran from the pump to the door and back to the ditch like a vein of bad luck finding its way home. And the house shuddered, and the cottonwood leaned as if to throw its last good arm over everything, and the baby in Calla's arms drew breath to announce himself again. As the porch steps split and dropped a half-inch with a thunderclap little enough to be only a promise. Benno grabbed the jam. Juri swore and braced. Gideon, already moving, turned toward the collapsing bank, and a rider in black darted past Bram's shoulder, hand coming up with a bottle necked with rag and flame, fast as nightmare and twice as stupid, and through, straight at the open window of the bedroom where Calla stood with her son. She saw the glass bloom, a mouthful of fire coming toward the bed, and the world became two choices and no time. She turned, the way the creek turns when rock tells it no, and the next second she would choose would be the one that either saved her child or burned her house down around them. And outside, Gideon was already in the air, sling and all, a body between flame and everything else, when the cottonwood's last arm finally gave up pretending it belonged to the sky and came down. The light went red,
and then white, and then
Black. For an instant, black the way a well is black when your voice drops into it and doesn't come back. Not the black of absence, but the black of everything at once, crowding the eyes until they confess they are small. Sound returned first. The whump of the cottonwood's last arm striking porch and yard, the smash and scatter of glass, a man's breath leaving him the way a nail leaves board when the grain finally gives. Then light, ragged and red, shaky around its edges where flame licked air and found it wicked. Calla did not drop. The world did around her, planks sagging a finger's width under her boots, but her body had chosen already which direction it belonged to. Forward. She pivoted, baby clutched to her, shoulder flattening to take the brunt of the air that came at her on fire. He'd kissed her cheek and recoiled from the wet of birth and sweat. A thread of hair seared and curled. Her son wrenched his face away from the heat as if he remembered some old, wordless lesson about light that burns and light that saves. Something large and human hit the window frame before the bottle did. Gideon, sling and all, launched from the yard with the clean stupidity only love makes rational, his body in front of the arc of flame, his boot heel finding the sill, his palm taking glass like ice into itself and choosing not to bleed yet. He caught the bottle with his bad hand because his good was busy catching the house, and for one sliver of impossible time, Calla watched him hold fire like a strange infant and look it in its one wet, mad eye. "Benno!" he barked without looking, and the old foreman moved so fast the air had to scramble to refill the space he left. Benno's hat appeared at the corner of her sight, and with it, the soaked burlap they'd been keeping at the pump for the next emergency, which apparently was this one. Gideon shoved the bottle into the sack, and Benno twisted, his great hands making a tourniquet out of jute and flame. The rag choked, the glass groaned and died an ugly death, shards biting Benno's knuckles. He did not swear, which was how Calla knew it hurt a great deal. The cottonwood's branch had not fallen clean. It lay across the boards like an old soldier who'd walked as far as the road would let him and then lay down to look at the stars he'd earned. One hen rested on the porch rail, splintering it into kindling the color of fresh bread. The other chewed a furrow into the yard toward the pump where water leapt in panic, as if the tree had come down trying to drink. The rider in black who'd thrown the bottle saw his work strangled and found himself suddenly out of talent. He reached for a second flask at his belt. Jory's salt rock erupted again. The man howled and went over backwards like a lesson. Bram yanked his horse away fast, and the federal man, hatless Humbler, threw up a hand as if he could stop physics. Eamon's face worked itself through contempt into hunger and back to contempt, hungry for a story he could ride home with. Inside, Doc Hollis's voice came thin with effort through the furnace air. "Keep him wrapped, Calla girl, skin to skin. He'll think the world is worth the trouble that way." She tucked her son tight against her chest, the slick feet of him cooling into a new kind of warm that seemed to come from the center of her and go back to it. He rooted, furious and efficient. She hissed with pain and then let it be part of the math. The world narrowed to two jobs again: make a person live and deny men their tools. The floor bucked, a sideways shudder that had nothing to do with flame. The second powder charge at the ditch snapped the old bank, and the ground trembled its complaint up through the house's bones. Crockery talked on shelves. The bed frame clicked in answer to the knife beneath it, as if agreeing to help. Water made a sound like a crowd making up its mind. It began to run where it hadn't in 100 years. Gideon looked over his shoulder toward the south like a man hearing his name shouted from 3 canyons at once. Benno saw the same way. Their eyes met and made a choice without discussing.
"I've got him," Benno said, meaning Egan, meaning everything with a gun and a grievance. "Go put the river back in its shirt." Gideon swung off the sill. He hit the porch and winced as the broken arm of the cottonwood scolded his bad shoulder on the way past. He staggered one step and turned it into a stride, because that's a trick men learn when their bodies don't take orders as fast as they used to. He ran, the slow, unfavorable run of a big man who is all endurance and convinced the ground is his to dictate to, and the yard made way. Doc, with hands wet and clean, stepped aside. Jory, with eyes hot and alive, shoved a bucket into Gideon's path without caring if it spilled.
Strangers who'd come to watch, now drafted into a bucket line by shame and Benno's tongue, lifted their chins and pretended they had always intended to work. Egan swung down at last, boots kissing dirt like he punished it. He put a hand to the raw stripe Gideon's bullet had made across his knuckles earlier, and smiled all over again, showing Calla the child in him that loved bad ideas more than bread. He took a step. The porch shadow he'd been warned about put itself on his boot like law. Benno's gun cocked, the slight sound loud enough to move birds 3 cottonwoods over. Egan stopped and tilted his head as if to listen to his own foolishness. Wiley, behind him, fumbled at his heel to retie the blue ribbon that fastened his loose heel, and in that moment looked so painfully young, Calla tasted pity and spat it out again, because pity had nearly burned her house. Bram gathered the tatters of his dignity. "Ms. Merrick," he began, aiming for reasonable and hitting rasp, "you must see the larger picture." "I see it fine," Calla said, and did not lift her voice. "It's made up of men who think larger means something that happens to other people's houses." A new cry went up at the south fence, the sound men make when they realize a thing is stronger than their wish that it wouldn't be. The ditch water had found the break and was eating it, greedy. Gideon dropped down the bank and vanished a second, then reappeared waist-deep, shoulders punching into the brown current with the same patient, mulish ferocity Calla had seen when he drove fence posts through shale. He wrestled stones into the breach, the water shoved back, he shoved harder. Men leapt down after him in a staggered flock, useless for 3 beats, and then useful when his voice found them and placed their hands. Inside, Doc's hands were calmer than anyone's. "Afterbirth," he said, businesslike, and something in Calla that had been braced for more war loosened. Then did not. A warm spill became a rush and didn't quit fast enough. Doc's mouth tightened by a degree. "Breathe," he said, too soft, too evenly. "We're not done being brave." Calla knew that tone. It was the one men used when a horse was worth saving, and the ditch was deep. Fear tried to open its mouth. She pressed her teeth together until it couldn't. "Tell me," she said, not a plea. "A bit of bleeding," Doc said, which in his mouth could mean the sky is falling or a cut finger depending on what he didn't want to say yet. He set his palm like a weight just under her navel and pressed in a steady circle that felt like an insult and a rescue at once. Bodies got to remember to squeeze. It forgot a second. Remind it. She bore down and the world tilted and then righted, as if a picture frame had slipped on its nail and someone fixed it with a thumb and pretended it hadn't happened. The bleeding slowed, not enough for Doc's shoulders to lower, enough for his eyes to leave the worst part and return to the whole of her. "Good," he said. "Again." Outside, Benno's sermon kept going. It had gotten louder and acquired swearing. "A man who sets a fire to a bed is saying he was never going to be invited into one honestly," he told Egan, almost cheerful, gun steady. "Put your clever back in your pocket before it embarrasses you again." "I'm embarrassed for you," Egan drawled. "Guard dog for a big man who thinks he can put his paws on a widow's porch and belong there?" Benno grinned, all broken ear and humor. "I'm older than you enough to know belonging has longer memory than taking. Besides, look at you, standing there like you've been waiting all your life for someone to tell you no." It landed, unexpectedly. Egan's mouth twitched. He glanced past Benno at Calla in the window, at the baby at her breast, at the knife under the bed that he could not see but somehow felt scraping a line in the floor between decent and indecent. He looked for Bram's eyes and found them elsewhere. He looked for Wilder law in the federal man's badge and found instead a man who was wondering when in his career he'd started being this sort of fool. Egan Rusk found himself alone in a circle of things he had created and did not like the look of.
"Pack it up," he said to Wiley without turning. "We'll come back when the creek forgets this road." Wiley blinked, anger and relief slapping at each other on his face, and then did as he was told in the one thing he was good at. He gathered his pride and his loose-heeled boot, and the blue ribbon fell into the dust again as if it preferred honest dirt to the work it had been hired for. Bram wheeled his horse in a tight, insulted circle. He tried for eloquent, found none. Threw the government's authority around like a dish rag and discovered it soaked in heavy, but useless against fire and women. The federal man managed to shrug, surprising in its modesty. "I'll need to file a report," he murmured to no one in particular. "It will say something about unforeseen circumstances."
"You can file it with Doc's towels," Kella said, breath flattening into something more like itself. She shifted the baby to the other side, and he complained as if she had changed the laws of physics. "They're all going to laundry together." Gideon's shout pulled every head toward the ditch again. "Stone," he called, throat raw. "Bigger, not pretty, heavy." Men ran. Some came back, some didn't, having discovered the part of themselves that hides when the water wins. Eamon and Wiley mounted and left not in a hurry, but not slowly either. Bram stayed long enough to be seen trying to look like authority, and then turned his horse and made Dust feel dishonored. The house breathed out. The cottonwood's corpse tilted its shade a hair like a blessing it hadn't meant to give. Binno's gun finally lowered, the weight of it leaving his and the day's bones. He put it away with the kind of precision that makes a story into a tool, and set his shoulder under the fractured branch where it gnawed the porch rail. "Don't!" Kella called without meaning to. The word rolled up and out of her as if someone had taught it to her in the cradle. "Binno, your back!" "It's my back," he said, not unkindly, and lifted. Jory slid in beside him, cat ready, and the two of them eased the limb down into the yard where it would make good stove wood tomorrow, if tomorrow wanted to behave. Doc pressed again. The bleeding slowed further, mother and body bargaining, and the doctor interpreting like a man who'd been hired by both sides and loved them each despite themselves. "You're holding," he said after another minute. "Keep holding. I'll mix you something bitter and call it medicine." He sniffed. "It won't have a label because Bram's sort charge extra for printing." Kella laughed, small and sharp, and then stopped because laughing tugged at the stitches Doc's hands had placed with the concentration of a watchmaker. She kissed the baby's hair to apologize to both of them for movement. He ignored apology because hunger is a good mentor. Gideon reappeared at the door, brown water pasted to his trousers, hair plastered to his forehead, sling soaked and dark. He looked at the baby and then up at her with a face like a man checking the sky for signs he'd made a bargain with instead of with God. "We bought the ditch in afternoon, no more. The bank will need sacks and hands all night. I'll send for more men who like me better than they like Rusk, which is most of the county that likes to sleep with its cattle alive." "Sleep?" Kella asked, trying on the word like a dress she once owned and had outgrown. He said, "Someday," with a little wince that might have been a smile. He stepped inside finally, toe to heel, a giant Careful in a china shop he loved. He stopped just past the threshold, as if asking the house's permission each time he entered. His eyes took quick inventory. Doc, pale and fierce. Kella, upright and not dead. The child, breathing like a tiny bellows that had learned its job too fast. The bed, the knife, the bowl, the wet rags, the water, the shine of glass on the sill where none should be. "You burned your hand," Kella said, because the smell of singed skin had finally threaded through the other smells and found her. Gideon looked down, as if surprised to find his palm there at all. It was blistering in a tender crescent where the bottle's neck had kissed it. He closed his fist and opened it again, a farmer testing a field. "We'll call it even," he said. "It tried to burn a house." Doc made a noise that was not a laugh, but not. "Sit," he told Gideon, the way he told stalled calves to lie down and live. He washed and wrapped with a gentleness he'd deny if asked. Gideon endured, eyes on Kella, mouth quiet as bread. "Name him," Joy blurted from the doorway, sudden and young, as if the day would not admit the child fully until it had a weapon to call him by. The room stilled, in that odd way names make it do. Kella looked down at the boy's mouth, at his furious lash of dark lashes glued together with damp. She had been hoarding names since Ezra died like matches in a jar. She had said some of them to the stove and found them tasteless on her tongue. She had whispered others into her pillow, and they had been too bright, burning her ear. She wanted something that the boy could wear without having to explain it to other men. She tasted 3. The 4th rolled into her mouth like a wheel run true. "Rowan," she said, surprised at her own certainty, and then not, because the surveyor had shown Truth how to stand up to numbers, and because the cottonwoods had held, and the creek had made its argument without lying, even the part of it that the men had blown apart. "Rowan Merrick." Doc's eyebrows climbed. He said, "After a tree that drinks lightning. Good, you'll need the habit." Gideon's mouth moved in a shape she recognized but hadn't seen on him, something like wonder when it noticed it was allowed to be sturdy. "Rowan," he tried, very softly as if not to wake the name. The baby ignored all of them and ate.
Night found its seat. The bucket line became a trickle. Jory passed out on the porch with his shotgun across his knees and the pump handle in his hand like he was afraid it would bolt. Benno snored once on purpose to make 3 men laugh because laughter puts weight on a building. It keeps it from blowing over. The cottonwood, dead and not as dead as it looked, held the last of the day's heat in one erased arm and gave it back to the porch like charity. Kala dozed. 2 minutes, 5, a handful cut into pieces. In one of them, her mother came and sat where the rocker should be and said nothing, and that was the best thing anyone had done for Kala all day. In another, Ezra passed the window on a horse that was not his and tipped his hat, and she didn't ask him to stay because the living shouldn't hold the dead hostage to their own proof of strength. Toward morning, when the sky was graphite and the horizon scratched a thin silver against it, Rowan Merrick decided a bellyful of milk was not as interesting as the world's fresh air. He let go, stretched, and stared at the ceiling with a disapproval that made Kala laugh into her own sleeve. Then his eyes rolled back like a colt discovering sleep, and he went boneless into the deep country where babies go without needing maps. Quiet. Honest quiet. The kind nobody gives you. You take it and defend it with your teeth. Gideon was a dark block in the doorway, leaning one shoulder against the frame, not looking at her on purpose, because a man should turn his back to a woman's work once it's his turn to guard the door. He turned his hand, and the lamplight jumped off the clean white around his palm. "He's right," he said, in a low voice that could have been talking to the baby or the house or the part of himself that still didn't quite believe the day. This was a good idea. "Which?" she asked, exhausted enough to be literal. "All of it," he said. Then, after a beat, as if he owed the truth interest, staying, fighting, not giving Bram the thing he thought he could buy, bringing a child to a place that acts like it wants to earn him. "You sound like a man offering a prayer who hasn't in a while," she said. "I sound like a man counting. It's the only way I know not to get lost." She said nothing. There are some answers that are the wrong shape if spoken aloud. He pushed off the jam like he'd remembered his body owed the day one more thing. "Dana says the men who blew the bank are drinking in the back of Kettering's office. He's got enough sand to try again at sunup, and Kenyon wrote him a warrant strong enough to make Bram sneeze." He paused. "I should be in town before anyone remembers to be brave the wrong way." "You'll come back?" Her voice was almost steady. Absolutely not a plea. He looked at her, at the child, at the window where dawn was loosening its belt, and the answer in his face made her chest hurt. "There isn't a road I'd rather be on," he said simply, "even if all I do is stand at that cottonwood and scare shadows into learning my name." "Don't scare them. Teach them." He tipped 2 fingers off his hat brim, because sometimes a man needs a ritual to help his feet remember which way to go. He left. She slept then, not because the world allowed it, but because her body decided to collect a debt. Benno snored and the creeks mutter, and the far hum of men being good or lucky made a lullaby that would have sounded like ruin to anyone not born to it. The baby breathed. The house held. The knife lay under the bed like a story someone might ask for someday, and Calla told it to stay there. She woke to shouting that didn't sound like fear. That made it strange. Men don't shout like that unless they've seen a thing that revises what they knew about their world and didn't ask their permission. Calla sat too fast and the room seesawed, then caught itself. The shout came again, nearer, the edge of a laugh on it, or maybe hysteria. She put Rowan into the crook of the rocker and braced him there with pillows and towels that had learned their jobs and grabbed the pistol because habit. She went to the window. Riders. 10, 12. Not Rusk's men, not Gideon's either. Men with hats pulled low and dust thick on their coats and a way of sitting a saddle that said they did it all day and sometimes all night. One had a blue kerchief at the throat, the exact color of the ribbon that had tried to pretend to be a cobbler's work. Another's horse was a bay with a white stocking that made it look half formal, half drunk. Wade called, cheerful as a man ordering eggs. "We heard there were two kinds of business in this yard, one you can eat and one you can't. We've come about both." "Come about the one that keeps you beyond my gate. It's the healthier one for you." Wade grinned like the boy he'd been before a winter had turned him mean. "Orders from town," he sang. "Judge's seal, Dana's signature, Bram's pen got tired overnight." He pulled a folded paper from his vest, not thick, like a deed, thin like a demand. He read without getting down. "Seizure of implements used to abet riot," he intoned. "Namely, firearms, unlawful barricades, lumber appropriated from the county ditch, and any and all foreign aid presently found on the property owned by one Calla Merrick widow." He looked up with innocence weaponized. "That's us, the foreign aid." "Foreign?" Doc barked. "You're from 3 canyons over. The only thing foreign about you is your idea of debt." Wade winked like the boy he'd been before a winter had turned him mean. "Orders from town," he sang. "Kettering writes things prettier." Jory bristled. Benno didn't. He smiled like a man finding a coin behind a liar's ear. "Read the judge's name again," he invited. Wade obliged, not seeing the trap. "Signed by," he squinted. "Signed by Judge Kenyon." He coughed to cover the stumble. "Kenyon can't sign before sunup from the livery with a whiskey glass in his hand, and he can't sign from his bed for 2 days because the graze on his brow made his wife lock the door. That paper's Bram's with a ribbon on it, and the only thing it can seize is the idiot that delivered it."
Wade's grin didn't fade fast enough for the men behind him to pretend they hadn't seen it crack. The fake marshal shifted in his saddle. His hand twitched toward the gun he wore too high. "We can take what we like," he said softly. "Law is what men agree it is." Doc stepped forward so fast everyone had to step back to keep from getting stepped on. "Law is what keeps you from dying stupid today," he said, the scalpel in his voice finely visible. "And right now the law says that paper is wind. The woman inside that house is a patient of mine and might be dying. The child inside that house is 10 hours old and will not. You try that door, I will take your hand off at the wrist and call it preventive medicine." The not marshal laughed. It was a poor sound. "Try," he suggested. Benno's gun was simply in his hand, the way a hammer is in a carpenter's before an argument begins. "No," he said to the man. "You try." Wade Grizzle wasn't brave enough to die. He turned his horse slightly and spat, as if the earth hadn't had enough spit on it already. "Tell Pike," he said to Benno, "if he wants to play sheriff again, there's an opening. The one we brought can't read. But if he wants to play federal man, there's a price on that game men like Rusk can afford, and he can't." Benno smiled kindly. "I'll tell him you came trying out for clown and weren't funny." They left, not as quick as Wise, but faster than men who intend to stay. Benno watched until the dust stopped looking like it might turn around. Then he let out a breath he'd been hoarding and turned toward the door. "They'll be back with letters that know how to spell," he said, "but this bought an hour." Calla leaned her forehead on the windowsill and rested there because she could. The bleeding had slowed into what Doc called proper, and her heart, which had been living in the roof beams since yesterday, climbed back down into her ribs and took a chair. Rowan slept with his mouth open, unashamed. The house gave a tiny creak like a ship adjusting to a wave, and then settled. Gideon returned in the middle of the morning with 3 men who looked like the kinds of fences fathers wish for daughters. Solid, dull, loyal. From Miller's, they liked their milk unburned. He looked older by a year and younger by 3 at once. He looked at Calla and his face did that bare, winter thing that men do when they have an emotion they admire. He didn't hide it. He put his shoulder under it and lifted. "Town?" she asked. He said, "Mad, but not at us, at themselves for pretending Bram was a pillar and then finding out he was a broom handle with the paint wore off." He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his good hand, remembering the river's weight. Danner made 2 arrests and didn't ask Eamon for permission. Kenyon signed a writ with a bandage on his head and told Bram if he came near this road, he'd ride him out on a mule so slow it would make a hymn out of it. "And Bram?" "Bram's counting friends," Gideon said. "He's discovered the number shrinks when the sun's out." He glanced past her to Rowan, sleep-drunk and rude. Something opened in his face and didn't shut. "He's a good one," he said, as if talking about a yearling he could not afford to admire too much. "I didn't know I needed to see this." "You did," she said softly. "Everyone does." They moved through the day with that odd, post-battle carefulness people get when they'd like not to break the only good thing the last 24 hours had provided. Benno made lists and burned them after reading them aloud, because some paper is a liability. Jory alternated between walking the fence and sitting cross-legged under the cottonwood, telling Rowan about the parts of the world that sounded dangerous and turned out not to be if you were quick and had good hands. Doc napped in an upright chair and woke with jerks as if the day had left a hook in his shoulder. Elias Rowan came back mid-afternoon with a rolled map and a grin that showed a man learning how to scare a fox with facts. He said to Calla, "I traced the old channel. If you lay stone here," he tapped, "and here, the creek will remember itself. It's stubborn as a mule, but not as bright." He coughed as if ashamed to be excited. "I'd like to do it." "Do," Calla said. "Send me the bill. I'll pay it with wire and bread and cursing." He nodded, grave as if she had just promised to knight him with a shovel. At dusk, Gideon's men lit lanterns along the ditch like constellations and kept watch in pairs because pretending to trust the dark is how men get their pockets picked. The air smelled of singed wood, river mud, and onions someone had decided to fry to make the night believe in supper. Benno hummed an old song that didn't remember words. Jory fell asleep on the step again and kicked himself awake, embarrassed, and then did it again. Calla changed Rowan and marveled at how people were small at one end of their life, and then large in the middle, and then small again. She promised herself and him silently that she would let him be whatever size he needed to be without telling him it was wrong. The stars came. The creek, chastened, made a quieter case for itself than yesterday. The cottonwood, ghost, and sentinel stood. The world dared to settle. Which is when fate, having a flair for timing it had not earned, rolled a wagon down the road from town with 6 men on it and 2 lamps, and a shadow in the bed high enough to be a stack of lumber and dark enough to be a threat. Benno stood while still sitting. Gideon stepped into the yard with the kind of stillness the dangerous wear when they want to look not dangerous at all. Danner jogged beside the wagon, red-faced, desperate, cussing because he was out of breath and out of options. "Stop," he wheezed. "Stop, you—" He found a word Doc wouldn't permit and used it anyway. "You fools." The wagon didn't stop. It rolled straight into the yard, and horses glue and hooves slid, and the bed swayed, and the tarpaulin over the load snapped once, and Benno saw what lived under it, and said, very softly, "No. Dynamite." enough to turn a draw into a memory and a house into a prayer. "Who?" Gideon asked Danner without moving, every syllable a step he was willing to take if he had to. "Railman," Danner panted. "From over the ridge. Says there's a job out by the cut and he was working off old stock. Bram told him—" He swallowed. "Told him to deliver some leftover for ditch repairs. He didn't know. God help me. I don't think he knew. I tried to turn him at the fork and he said his orders were written and he couldn't read and he felt safest when he didn't try." The teamster, a big man with a soft, blank face and a scar like someone had taught him lessons he hadn't deserved, stood and took off his hat and held it like he had apologizing to do to an entire county. "Ms.," he said to Calla, who had come to the doorway because there is no world where she would not now. "I'm Caesar. I brought the powder. I ain't set to use it. I'm set to take it where paper says. But the sheriff says paper lied. He showed me where. I can take it somewhere else if you tell me, or I can leave it right here and run." He tried a smile that was toothsome and tragic. "I don't run fast." Gideon stepped forward with deep, slow, careful built into his bones. "You can leave it right here," he said, "and then you can help me move it, by hand, one stick at a time, to the rat quarry, where it belongs, and on the way we will talk about how paper talks when men like Bram ask it to." Caesar nodded, relieved to have been told a thing plainly. He climbed down. He pulled the tarp. The dynamite lay underneath in orderly sticks like a soldier's bed after inspection. Benno said, in a voice that made no arguments possible, "Jory, if you so much as breathe wrong, I'll whip the air for letting you." Jory froze, fascinated and properly terrified. Doc went pale and then pink, and then was suddenly very interested in the inside of the house, which he had decided needed guarding from fireworks. Danner got his hand on the wagon wheel and didn't let go, as if maybe his courage would feel better with something wooden in it. Gideon took the first stick, and he took it with his wrong hand, the burned one, which seemed foolish until Calla realized he was trusting the damaged part to tell him the truth faster if heat started where it shouldn't. He carried it away from the porch, walking as if he were carrying a newborn, and set it under the cottonwood's corpse arm where shade kept air cooler and humidity brave. Caesar followed, careful, eyes huge. Benno took two because he had earned the right to be reckless with his own back if he wanted to. Danner reached for one, and Gideon said, "No," quiet as water, and the sheriff pretended he had intended to supervise instead. They moved it like that for a while. The night held its breath because it had better sense than men. The sticks made a small wall where last night's fire had tried to make a larger one. Somehow it felt like a prayer said backward to make a blessing out of a curse. Halfway through the load, a shout rolled down from the ridge. Thin, high, urgent, a boy's voice. Brock. He cried along the wind, "Riders, South Road, Rusk, Wiley, 4 more." Of course. Of course, Eamon would arrive when the yard was full of explosives and the ditch was brittle and a woman stood in her doorway with a 10-hour-old son and a pistol she had no business having to pick up again today. Of course. Gideon didn't look at Calla. Benno did. The old man's mouth made a small private oath he had never learned in church. He said, no flourish, we can stack what's left and stand, or we could roll this wagon out of here and give 'em one less toy to play with. Calla said, roll it. Her voice did not tremble. Jory, hitch. Danner, do the job you swore, not the one Bram pays you for. Benno, she met his eyes. If I put you between this house and Eamon again, will you burn me for using up good men? I burn slow, and I like the smoke. He smiled with half his mouth. Besides, the last time I checked, I wasn't done living. Gideon lifted the last crate with Caesar and they pitched it onto the ground just in case the wagon failed them. Jory had lines in his hands before anyone could draw him a picture. The team leaned, the wheels bit dirt, and the cart groaned itself back into motion, heading for the quarry with luck and 2 men's prayers strapped to it. Eamon's riders broke into the yard's edge before the wagon cleared the gate.
Wiley's heel clacked, a ridiculous bell tolling its own doom. Rusk reined up like a vaudeville villain, a smile slashed onto his face. "Afternoon," he sang. "We brought a gift last night. Thought we'd see how you liked it." His eyes tracking the dynamite made Calla's insides go to ice. He turned the smile on her. "Like this," she said, and lifted the pistol, not at him, but at the sky just above his shoulder. She fired. The crack chopped the scene into pieces and then remade it with everyone in new places they hadn't chosen. "Gideon," Benno said. "Here," Benno answered, already moving. "Danner," Gideon said, not looking at the man because he needed him to be brave on his own, and a gaze would steal that from him. "Here," Danner said, and to his credit, was. "Calla," Gideon said, and this time he did look. "I'm here," she said, and the rock of the doorway under her feet and the weight of her son at her chest made the sentence so true it felt like it could be used to build with. Riders fanned, guns glinted. Caesar cursed soft in Spanish and kept the wagon moving because momentum is sometimes more useful than valor. Brock hooped from the ridge to try to make his fears sound like a story he'd tell later that would make girls look at him the way he wanted them to. He failed, but he kept yelling anyway, which was a skill. Eamon put his horse a hair forward. Benno's muzzle kissed the inside of that hair like a judgment. Wiley panicked in the courage, jerked his gun and found Jory's rock salt again, and this time it tattooed his chest so fine he would count the dots later and remember the day he stopped wanting to be a dog that chased wagons. "Turn back," Gideon said. He had his voice in his hand now, and men who don't will trade their souls for it. Eamon's laugh was tired. "We're all that. I'd like mine to end with a fence in my favor." He lifted his gun. "Then let it end," Benno said, and the world drew breath to choose. Rowan squeaked. It wasn't loud, it wasn't much, but Calla's whole body turned toward the sound because no part of her belonged anywhere else. She turned and saw his face scrunch, a slow tide of indignation, the little sucking mouth hunting because hunger always believes itself. And she laughed, absurdly and wholly and helplessly, because the exact same sound had come out of her an hour ago when Benno scolded Danner for breathing wrong. She turned back, pistol still up, spine still straight, and discovered the entire yard had flinched she didn't know how far in the time it took to look at her son. Eamon's barrel was no longer on Gideon. It had tilted, ever so slightly, down and certain. At the dynamite. "Don't," she said, at once a prayer and an order. He smiled with the side of his face that didn't care what happened next. "Make me," he said, and Gideon moved, and Benno moved, and Danner did something with his feet that made them brave all the way up his legs. Jory yelled, because there is power in humiliating a villain when you're too small to throttle him. Caesar hit the wagon with his hip and it popped through the gate like an apology. End of Monday movie, end of living too long, end of building too close to the river. Eamon fired. The bullet took the rear corner of the crate Benno had set down last and punched a neat bite out of fragrant pine. It did not hit anything that cared about exploding today. It did wake sleeping judgment. Gideon's shot came so close behind Eamon's that it was more echo than answer. Eamon's hat leapt and spun and fetched up in a black puddle left by last night's pump. Wiley's eyes went huge, then closed, as if the world had been too bright for a second. "Enough," Calla said, and the word finally sounded like the thing it named. "I have bled into this house. I have forgiven this earth for almost failing us. I have watched men relearn the words no and mine and law in 3 different orders and survive it. If you want to go on living where I can see you, you will turn around and ride home and tell the truth." She stepped forward onto the porch plank that had cracked and then held. "Tell them the widow told you no, and you obeyed her because she knew the river, and you didn't." It was a humiliation Eamon could not bear.
He lifted his gun, fast, desperate, the way men do when they want to erase the last minute of their lives and write it again, and something in Calla that had been holding the line since yesterday said no more. Without discussing with her good sense, without asking permission from Doc or Gideon or Benno or the god who was busy elsewhere, she stepped down off the porch and onto the yard's hardpack with the pistol level and the baby at her chest and the last of the cottonwood's shade rolling away from her shoulders like a cloak rolling off a queen. "Amen," she said. "Don't make me shoot you with my son in my arms." It startled him, not the threat, the image.
He smiled, ugly. He cocked the gun. There was no time. The report didn't come from Calla. It didn't come from Gideon or Benno or Danner. It came from the ridge. One clean, long shot, high and dismissive as a hawk's cry. It took Eamon's wrist, clean through, shock rather than ruin, and the gun flew as if grateful to leave the job it had been hired for. Eamon stared at the red surprise on his hand the way a child stares at his first betrayal. Every head snapped to the ridge. Brock stood there with Jory's second-best rifle snug to his shoulder, jaw clenched, eyes wet. He didn't lower the barrel until Benno nodded. Then he did, and he made a noise like laughing and crying had decided to get married without telling him. "Go home," Benno told Eamon very gently. Eamon did, not fast, not slow. Pride bleeding from him in a thread that would mark the road all the way back to the house where his mother had taught him to pray, and then died and left him to confuse hunger with power. Wiley followed, white spots on his shirt and a ribbon on his heel that finally surrendered to the dust and lay there, ruined and beautiful. The other men went because they were not going to die for someone else's story about a survey marker. Silence. Then the yard remembered how to breathe. Gideon exhaled like a lever finding rest. Danner sat down abruptly on the bottom step, as if gravity had played a joke and he was willing to laugh at it. Doc hugged himself and discovered there are some things even a doctor can't fix and doesn't need to. Caesar wiped his forehead with a sleeve and said, almost shy, "I'm going to the quarry now, Mrs. Merrick." Calla nodded. "Take our thanks with you," she said. He beamed like a boy with a penny. Benno looked at Brock and said, "You'll be remembering today until you die. Try to remember the part where you chose a better story." Brock nodded until his hat fell over his eyes and then nodded some more. Gideon looked at Calla. She looked back. There was a great deal to say. None of it needed lights and witnesses. Doc snapped, papering over tenderness with orders as was his habit. "Drink, sit, sleep, all of you. If anyone falls over, I will pretend he is a calf and fix him accordingly." The day began to be ordinary again in the way days do after they have nearly broken and then remembered their manners. Ditch muttered but stayed where it had been reminded to. The cottonwood's corpse glowed mildly in the late sun and turned orange like it had decided to be pretty one last time. Dusk. Supper. The smell of onions finally paid out in stew. Rowan woke with the outrage of a man pulled from a good dream and then forgave them all and ate. Calla dozed in rope lengths and woke because some part of her did not trust the dark to stay in its lane even with other people guarding it. Gideon sat on the step and rolled his burned palm gently against his knee like he was telling it not to forget what fire had felt like. Benno snored a sermon. Jory counted his rock salt like a gambler who had switched to counting blessings out of necessity. Stars, crickets, a fox, a distant fiddle from town, thin as good intentions. The creek, nearly polite. Calla thought, perhaps foolishly, that they might be allowed one quiet. She closed her eyes and awoke to the sound of a horse ridden too hard. Not Rusk, not Wade Gristle's lot. A different cadence, frantic, sloppy, untrained. The animal blew and staggered to a stop, like even its hooves knew the news was bad and wanted to slow it down. A boy, thin, scared, dust white, fell out of the saddle and onto his knees in the yard. "Pike! Gideon Pike! He gulped and looked at Calla, at the baby at her breast, at Benno, at Danner, at Jory, at Doc, at the whole yard like a jury he hadn't intended to assemble. He blurted, "They took your sister," to Gideon. "Rusk's boys from town. Bram told them where she'd be, said, the fastest way to fix a river is to make a man move his dam." The yard went quiet in a new way. Not frightened, not brave. The way land gets before lightning explains itself. Gideon stood straight. "Where?" he said. "Old grain elevator, by the spur that never got built. They said to come alone, that if you didn't, they'd light a fuse and let God measure the pieces." He started to cry in small, furious bursts. "I tried to stop them, Mr. Pike. I tried. They said a boy who can't grow a beard yet should keep his mouth shut until someone buys him a razor." Doc breathed out. Benno looked at the ground like it had failed him. Danner swore into his hands. Jory went very still, then very bright like steel goes before it breaks or is made into a better shape. Calla's heart did something large and quiet inside her chest. She looked at Gideon and saw a man who had spent a life learning to pull his temper up like a draw well and cap it when he had to. She saw that cap come off. Not angry. Not yet. Awe. The kind that makes men dangerous to the people who put their hand on the pump handle. He said, "I'll go." And his voice was not the one he had used all day. It was older and cleaner and worse. He turned once to Calla, not as a goodbye, not as a promise, but a thing that said more than either. Then he looked at Benno and didn't have to speak the rest. Benno answered anyway. "We'll hold the line, and if Rusk left us more gifts at the ditch, we'll send them back with interest." He glanced at Danner. "You'll be coming if you want to keep wearing that tin and not have it look like a joke when you shave."
Danner stood. "I am," he said, surprising himself first, then the rest of them. Jory reached for his shotgun. Gideon shook his head once. "No," he said. "You stay with the house." "I'm not a child," Jory snapped, immediate and ashamed of being so. "I know," Gideon said. "That's why I'm asking you to do a man's job." He tipped his chin at Calla and Rowan and the knife under the bed and the cottonwood and the ditch and the new stones and all the work that had to be held while men went off to do stupid things that were also necessary. Guard what we made. Jory looked at Calla. She nodded, authority and plea and command and blessing, all at once. He swallowed, squared, and took his post at the gate like a soldier who had finally been given the right war. Gideon swung up. The Dun snorted like a prayer starting. Benno adjusted the sling on Gideon's shoulder with the kind of tenderness men won't admit to in daylight. Danner checked the loads on his revolver like he remembered how. The boy who'd brought the news hiccuped and then turned himself into a useful thing by holding the stirrup for a man who didn't need it. Gideon looked at Calla one last time. She didn't say be careful because careful is what men are when they think they'll get to come back. She said, go be right. He nodded. They rode. Dust took them and changed its mind. Let them go, then took them again, like the world couldn't decide whether to keep or return. Calla stood in the doorway, the weight of Rowan reminding her which part of the world she belonged to now, and watched until the road bent hard at the cottonwoods. Then she turned to the house and the ditch and the yard and the men who were left. She checked the latch on the pump's lamp and the tie on the baby's blanket and the thumbscrew on her own courage. The night, which had promised to be ordinary, put on its church hat and waited to see whether it was going to a wedding or a funeral. On the horizon, behind the grain elevator where the railroad had thought better of them and left a scar as tall as pride, a little light began to move. Not a star, not a lantern, a fuse. Calla's hands went cold. Benno's head turned like a weather vane that had just discovered it had a heart. Jory lifted the gun and set it down and lifted it again and found it heavy with the wrong problem. Danner, halfway to town, did not see the fuse's first inch burn, but Gideon did. He kicked the dun, and the dun lengthened under him like a road, and the dark leaned back to watch, pleased, because it might finally get to be useful. Calla held her son and the doorframe and the whole house with one hand and felt the deep old ground under her boots say a thing it had been saying to women like her since dirt learned to take footprints. Hold. She did. And the fuse burned down toward the powder stacked under the old elevator, and men she loved rode into a story that would either make this valley clean or bleed it empty, and the wind lifted like a breath that wouldn't finish, and the light went out, then came back, brighter. Gideon, she whispered, a name and a prayer and an order and a truth. Benno's hand found the door jamb and cracked the old paint with the strength of his grip. If he pulls that fuse, he said very softly, awe and fear braided in equal parts, he'll lose his hand. Then he'll do it with the one that burns, Calla said. He hates fires badly enough to love that pain. They watched the thin, wicked line draw itself across the night toward men, toward wood, toward choices. They watched and could not do a thing about it from where they stood. They watched until their eyes watered and the world narrowed to a point of light and a rider's silhouette and the memory of a cottonwood that had fallen to save a house. They watched until the fuse hiccuped and accelerated. God, Benno said. The light ate the last inch of safe ground, found the powder's mouth, and roared. The night went white, the earth sat up, the grain elevator coughed out its own lungs. A ring of fire unwound around the base like a woman letting down her hair for a fight. Men hit dirt because gravity thinks it's funny. The dun reared, then gathered cat swift and threw itself sideways out of the blast that went where it had meant to go since men invented carelessness. Calla couldn't breathe, then she could, then she was breathing for two again because her son startled, and she told him with her heart to be calm. The blast rolled across the valley and trotted up the porch and sat down at her feet and put its head on her knee like a dog asking for forgiveness. She put a hand on its head and told it no. Silence fell hard. Then the small sounds came back. The creek, offended. The wind remembering to move. Doc Hollis swearing at a star. Jory counting his own fingers as if he expected them to have left. Benno saying, well, to nobody, the way that men do when they are alive and surprised. The dust settled by degrees into a shape that had not been there before. The elevator torn and listing, its old bones showing, its ramp collapsed on one side like a drunk's smile. And a man on a horse at the edge of the blast, sitting very upright, holding something in his burned hand like the tail of a snake he had just convinced not to bite. Gideon. He turned the dun in a slow circle, checking everything, counting because counting is how a man keeps from yelling. He raised his hand once, small, toward the house. Calla raised hers back, huge, toward the horizon. And then, shouting, not his, not Danner's, another man's, high and ugly and happy. From behind the ruins figures moved where figures should not have been. Not Rusk, not Brams, new men, rail trash from over the ridge, faces she didn't know, and the way they held their guns said they liked the sound of them more than the reason they were invented. They came out of the broken elevator's shadow like roaches, delighted that someone had left sugar on the counter. They had Gideon boxed. The blast had cut the yard side away and left him facing an alley of splintered beams with men in it who thought a legend was the easiest thing in the world to shoot once it had done a noble, stupid, brave thing and was breathing hard. Calla tasted metal. Benno swore fresh. Jory lifted his shotgun and found out the truth about distance. Gideon wheeled for space that wasn't there. He lifted the burned hand half an inch, like a man greeting a dog he didn't trust, and the men in the alley smiled because they thought that was surrender. It wasn't. He went forward.
Calla did not know whether she said his name or Rowan's or God's. It didn't matter. The night took all three and threw them back at her as echo. And in that echo she heard the first shot come. And she didn't know, for one terrible breath, whether it had hit the man she'd come to trust with fences and with fear.